We're delighted you're here with us tonight and hope that you're finding pockets of peace during this very challenging season. Today is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As such, we enter this time tonight not reaching into conceptual space, but rather into a material past. And we do so with the sacred calling to remember, holding the truth of what was, placing those memories, stories, and facts into our minds at present, demanding our human past to overtake the present moment and require us to take account. Our speakers tonight, Professors Roger Frie and Susannah Heschel, will invite us into this remembrance in a very powerful way. I feel honored by their willingness to do so, and I look forward to beginning this time by introducing our esteemed guests. And then after I do so, I'll hand it off to Roger, and Susannah will give a bit of a discussion. I'll have a conversation, and we will have a period of time at the end to have conversation with the audience via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So let me start with Roger, our main speaker tonight. He's a dear friend and an amazing, generous human being. He's an inspiring scholar, unique in his interdisciplinary capacity. He isn't a psychologist with leanings towards history and philosophy, or a philosopher historian interested in psychology. Rather, he has a doctorate in both psychology and history and philosophy. This seeds a highly generative and exceptionally exciting corpus of truly expansive and interdisciplinary scholarship as he brings these fields together in a variety of creative ways. He's turned his attention, particularly in this last season of his scholarly work, to historical trauma, cultural memory, and human interaction. Roger has published 8 books, and his most recent out of Oxford University Press is titled Not in My Family, German Memory and Responsibility After the Holocaust. And you'll hear some of the discoveries in that book in tonight's lecture. This book has already won multiple awards in the last few years. And Roger is currently working on a new book that's going to contrast ordinary Germans who became complicit bystanders and enablers of the Nazi regime with those who chose to resist and help the victims of Nazism. He traces the lessons of the Nazi past for responding to current racial injustice and for challenging the bystander culture that surrounds us. Roger has taught all over the world and is currently a professor of education at Simon Fraser University and a faculty member and supervisor at the William Allenson White Institute in New York. I'm proud to say that Roger has been a speaker at our Psychology and the Other conferences since they began in 2011, and he gave the plenary address at one of them just a few years ago. His work has been truly transformative for the community. We're privileged to have him here tonight. Susannah Heschel, our discussant this evening, is a world-renowned scholar and a force of nature. Before I formally introduce her, I'd like to share a story that captures something of her way of being in the world. 2 years into my doctoral training, my advisor, Al Duick, asked me if I might be willing to pick up Susannah Heschel from the airport in Los Angeles. She was coming to town for several lectures. He asked me because I had just read Abraham Joshua Heschel for the very first time this semester before, and I was head over heels. I knew who I was going to finally write my dissertation on. I was very excited. So I was simply giddy at the thought of picking Susannah up. Little did we know that a huge rainstorm would come through, causing severe flooding, which meant Susannah was stuck in a car with me for over 2.5 hours. The conversation was amazing, and it was an absolute gift to me. But you want to know what actually took the cake in all of it? When we arrived at the campus, I was about to jump out of the car and get her bags and rush her to the next thing. And she told me to wait a second. And in a manner that still floors me, she encouraged me to continue exploring some of the intersections we had discussed between her father's work and the field of psychology. Stayed with me. That's what I'm doing still. And then she offered to help me and be available if I ever needed anything from her. After 2.5 hours in a car with me, I would have bolted. But instead, she showed me who she is, an incredibly giving and generative person. By the way, I then asked her to be a member of my dissertation committee, and she worked me really hard, but that's good. That's good. I appreciate it a lot. So now for the more formal description of this extraordinary work that she's doing in the world, though it won't even do justice. Susannah is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. She is author of over 100 articles, several edited books, and many scholarly manuscripts of her own, including The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologians, and the Bible in Nazi Germany with Princeton. Susannah's scholarship frequently focuses on Jewish and Protestant thought during the 19th, 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship, Jewish scholarship on Islam, and the history of anti-Semitism. She is currently a Guggenheim Fellow and is writing a book on the history of European Jewish scholarship on Islam. She's received 4 honorary doctorates from universities in the United States, Canada, and Germany, and has been a visiting professor at several prestigious universities around the world. Susannah, too, has been an early supporter of the Psychology and the Other conference and was a plenary speaker at one of our conferences a few years ago. She has always been very true to her offer to me in that rainstorm, hence why she's with us tonight, broadcasting from a hotel room in Texas. We're delighted to have you here. So now, with no further ado, let me hand it over to you, Roger, and we'll look forward to have you invite us into this time of remembrance.
It's truly an honor to be here and to be able to speak with all of you on this solemn and important day of remembrance. And it's also just lovely and an honor to have Susannah Heschel discuss my talk this evening and for us to be able to have a conversation that, of course, also involves all of you. I'm going to share with you this evening some of my ongoing research and research that draws on my work as a psychoanalyst and as someone who was, I think, quite influenced by the ideas and work of Erich Fromm, but also as a historian, and as a historian of the period of the Holocaust and the Nazi past. And it was after my publication of Not in My Family, when I continued to do my research, that I first learned of the unpublished family correspondence within Erich Fromm's family during the Holocaust. And I want to thank Rainer Funk, the director of the Fromm Archive in Tübingen, for permission to share this material with you this evening. For those of you who are interested, it has not yet been published, though I'm in the process of finishing a book that should hopefully be out relatively soon on Erich Fromm and this particular period in his life and his relevance, I think, to our world today, given the crises, social and political, and the rise in anti-Semitism and racism that we're currently seeing and dealing with, regardless of what our backgrounds might be in terms of discipline or profession. So if you give me a moment, I'm just going to set up my screen here, and David or Darby, please feel free to let me know if something isn't working at any point in time during my talk. I anticipate talking for some 45 minutes, and then we will shift over to Susannah. As I think we all know, it always takes a moment to set up, so thank you for your patience. So I understand that you can now see that. This should be the title of the talk, Trauma and Silence, Erich Fromm, the Holocaust Correspondence and Historical Responsibility. Okay, thank you. I think we're all set up and ready to go now. In 2018, 80 years after the November pogrom of 1938, I stood in front of an audience in Pittsburgh to give a Kristallnacht memorial lecture. I felt honored to accept the invitation, but I also experienced trepidation. What might it mean for me, a grandson of the German generation of perpetrators and enablers, to speak on such an important and meaningful occasion? 2 weeks before my lecture, the unthinkable happened. 11 Jewish worshipers were brutally murdered at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, close to where I would speak. Nothing I had seen or done up to that point could possibly have prepared me to address members in a community that had just experienced the worst act of anti-Semitic violence in the history of the United States. I had spoken to many audiences about the obligations of memory, and I had talked about the emotional dynamics within German families that seek to keep the Holocaust at bay. I had explored the limits of Germany's memory culture and argued for the need to engage a felt sense of history's traumas. Up until that point, however, I'd always naively hoped that the dark shadows of Germany's Nazi history might remain consigned to the past. After the right-wing march on Charlottesville and the massacre in Pittsburgh, it became impossible to avoid the upsurge of Nazism into the present. In the years that followed, there have been more attacks on Jewish Americans, and racial hatred against Black, Indigenous, and people of color is everywhere in evidence. In Canada, where I live, incidents of anti-Semitism and racism have increased significantly. In Germany, the racially motivated riots in Chemnitz in 2018 and the attack on a synagogue in Halle a year later broke through Germany's culture of remembrance, leading many to wonder what, if anything, had been learned. It's easy to feel powerless in the presence of such hatred, but we cannot stay silent lest we become complicit in the evil we abhor. In view of the social and political crises we face today, the need to address the violence in our midst has rarely been more pressing. We must redouble our efforts to educate about the Holocaust and above all address the contemporary reality of anti-Semitism and racism. But what, we wonder, might this process involve? I'm not a specialist in anti-Semitism. Rather, as a historian and psychoanalyst, I seek to understand how we are shaped by the traumatic histories we inherit. The stories of our lives are always and already embedded in the history and culture of our families and communities. To paraphrase the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, we are born with the past, and whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it or not, we become the bearers of that history and culture. The question that concerns me is how the violent and traumatic past is intertwined with the hateful present. Indeed, as psychoanalysis reminds us, the effects of violent and traumatic histories don't disappear. They keep showing up, reminding us of their presence. Psychoanalysis has been called a traumatized profession because so many of its early members were directly and indirectly affected by the Holocaust. Our attempts to confront and understand the perpetration of genocide emerged out of a silence and silencing of the past. This process of addressing historical trauma, be it in the psychoanalytic profession or in society as a whole, was only possible with an acknowledgement of how we are shaped by society, politics, and history. There is perhaps no psychoanalyst who has so embodied the socio-political viewpoint as Erich Fromm. During a time when most clinicians felt that the individual's psyche and the analytic setting should be the sole focus of their attention, Fromm consistently and passionately addressed the reality of the social and political and human life. At the height of his popularity, Fromm was known as a purveyor of hope, a public intellectual and psychoanalyst whose writings offered humanity a way forward. But underlying this popular image was a more complex reality, a thinker and a clinician who kept returning to the threat posed by authoritarianism, racism, and destructiveness, ever wary what humans were capable of. In October 1979, only a few months before he died, Swiss television aired an interview with Fromm. The interviewer asked Fromm whether he thought humanity has changed as a result of the Holocaust. Fromm's answer was as brief as it was disquieting. From a social perspective, I do not see that we have changed so much for the better, that under certain historical circumstances, what happened 40 years ago could not also happen again. It would require that human beings had themselves significantly changed and become more alive, engaged, and courageous. But unfortunately, that is not something I can say, end quote. Fromm's bracing statement has been borne out by the genocides that have occurred since the Holocaust and by the levels of racial violence we see today. What is less known is the degree to which Erich Fromm's life experience shaped his socio-political approach. The rise of Nazism forced Fromm to leave his native Germany. After arriving in the United States in 1934, he witnessed Nazi Germany's perpetration of the Holocaust from afar. Many of his family members, together with his friends and colleagues, were murdered. This evening, I'm going to read directly from some of the unpublished Holocaust letters in Fromm's family. The letters allow us to glimpse the trauma experienced by a single German Jewish family, an unspeakable tragedy that was repeated over and over. We are easily overwhelmed by the sheer number of victims in the Holocaust, which is why I believe Fromm's family letters are so important. They break through the abstraction and historical distance with which we encounter the catastrophe. They also challenge us to explore what it means to be implicated in a systemic injustice and racial violence that shapes our societies today. Though Fromm remained publicly silent about his family tragedy, he responded through his writings, turning again and again to examine the social and political forces that give rise to destructiveness. He beseeches us to work towards building a just and better society, and he warns against engaging in a form of psychoanalysis that simply results in social adaptation. Let me begin with some brief biographical facts about Fromm's life. Born in 1900 into a middle-class German Jewish family in Frankfurt, Fromm completed his doctorate in sociology in the early 1920s before turning to psychoanalysis. The intertwining of psyche and society that came to define his work caught the attention of Max Horkheimer. In 1930, Horkheimer invited Fromm to join the Institute for Social Research. In the years that followed, Fromm wrote a series of important papers outlining how a group's social character unconsciously shapes the thinking, feeling, and acting of individuals in such a way that ultimately people want to act as they have to act. Among Fromm's noteworthy works from the early 1930s was his study of the character structure of the German working class. Based on a series of questionnaires, Fromm revealed pro-fascist tendencies amongst workers who were presumed to be solidly against authoritarianism. In 1933, when the Nazi Party was elected to power in Germany, Fromm could hardly know with any certainty what the future would hold. But he clearly knew enough to understand that he should leave. Once Fromm arrived in New York, he sought to establish himself in his new environment and joined with Karen Horney, Harry Stack Sullivan, and others to form what became known as the Cultural School of Psychoanalysis and what we now call interpersonal psychoanalysis. Fromm also played a central role in helping Horkheimer and the Institute move to its new home at Columbia University, though his role in the Institute is the subject of another talk and takes us beyond what we're going to talk about this evening. Fromm's chief psychoanalytic concern at the time was to expand the reach of the discipline and ensure that it spoke not only to the needs of individual psychology, but to the fundamental role of social and political forces in the shaping of all experience. As Fromm was developing these ideas, Anti-Jewish legislation in Germany was increasing at an alarming rate. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 disenfranchised Jewish Germans and prohibited them from participating in society and government. More laws and persecution followed, culminating in the November pogrom, which resulted in the widespread destruction of synagogues, businesses, and homes throughout Germany and Austria. The first mass deportation of Jewish men to concentration camps in the days that followed November 9th, 1938, presaged the wholesale deportation and murder of German and Austrian Jewish communities between 1941 and 1943. Living in New York and watching the events unfold from afar, Fromm was acutely aware of the threats posed by Nazi Germany, both to a democratic way of life and to the lives of his family, friends, and colleagues who still lived there. While Fromm's personal experience of the time remained firmly in the background, he responded through his writings, developing the ideas that led to the publication of Escape from Freedom in 1941. Fromm was one of the only European Jewish psychoanalysts to publicly write about the rise of Nazism while events were still unfolding. Given the ascendancy of anti-Semitism in the United States at the time, this was not without risk. The question that occupied Fromm was why so many of his fellow Germans were willing to follow Hitler and the Nazi regime. Fromm believed that Hitler provided millions of Germans with the means to escape economic and social uncertainties by submitting to a totalitarian authority. The emotional appeal of Nazi ideology lay, as Fromm writes, in its spirit of blind obedience to a leader and of hatred against racial and political minorities, its craving for conquest and domination, its exaltation of the German people and the Nordic race. Fromm's account of the appeal of authoritarianism has taken on new meaning in light of current political trends. And indeed, there's been a renewed interest in the arguments Fromm put forth as we face the contemporary growth of fascist politics in many nations. After arriving in the United States and throughout the decade to follow, Fromm was consumed with finding ways to rescue those left behind. Fromm was an only child. His father died of a heart attack in late 1933, having witnessed Hitler's rise to power. His mother chose to remain behind along with her siblings, believing, or at least hoping, that the ascent of the Nazis was a momentary madness. After the November pogrom, escaping Germany became extremely difficult. In order for Fromm's mother to leave, Fromm had to secure a large monetary loan to pay the Nazi regime. Rosa spent the next 18 months in England. Before she could join her son in New York, Fromm was required to pay another hefty fee, this time to the US authorities, whose policy for admitting Jewish refugees was harshly selective. In fact, as legal scholars have shown, the political and racial structure of America at the time, in the form of Jim Crow and racist immigration laws, provided the Nazi regime with an early model for how to enact its own racial laws. Rosa was finally able to join her son in New York in 1941, but a different fate awaited her siblings. Rosa had grown up in Berlin and most of her family still lived there. Her sister, Sophie Englander, and husband were deported from Berlin to Theresienstadt. Her brother, Martin Krause, and wife were deported to the Warsaw Ghetto and then to Auschwitz. Her beloved cousin, Gertrud Brandt, together with her husband and youngest son, were sent to a ghetto in eastern Poland and then to Treblinka. None survived. Fromm's cousins and second cousins who were able to flee in time were pursued and persecuted. Some were killed, others committed suicide. Fromm participated in a voluminous family correspondence from the time he emigrated until the end of the Second World War. Letters were exchanged amongst multiple family members. Each tried to keep the others abreast of developments in a constant search to save those left behind. Fromm came to play a central role in this process and helped his family members in whatever way he could, often sending money. But the draconian immigration policies and the prohibitive cost of exit visas severely limited what he was able to do. Part of Fromm's family correspondence has survived, and I will quote from the letters of Sophie Englander and Gertrude Brandt, both of whom were an important presence in Fromm's early life. Their letters illustrate the unfolding tragedy that beset a single German Jewish family over the course of the Holocaust. Some of the letters demonstrate the depth of the need and suffering that was endured. Others convey the strength of spirit, love of life, and unbreakable bonds between family members. It's hard to read the letters knowing of the tragedy that awaits the writers and the sadness that would confront family members who survived. I have slides of the letters so that you can follow as I read. If for any reason I should fall behind, perhaps Darby or David, you could just let me know. Best to do so vocally based on what I can see. Thank you. The letters of Sophie Englander. Sophie Englander's letters were written from Berlin over a 3.5-year period, from March 1939 until September 1942, when she and her husband were deported to Treblinka. They were addressed to her younger daughter, Eva, who left for La Paz, Bolivia, with her husband and their 2 children in the spring of 1939. The letters document the ever-worsening situation of Berlin's Jewish community. Families were forced out of their homes and into shared accommodations. Children were forced out of regular schools and into overcrowded, segregated schools. What seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier was now a cruel and inescapable reality. Beginning in the autumn of 1941, members of Berlin's Jewish community were arrested and deported to concentration camps and ghettos. The following is a selection from a much broader group of letters. March 10th, 1939. This morning, your letter from Stralsund arrived and gave us great joy. The children appear to have been exemplary. Hopefully, the border crossing with the ferry and the onward trip to Stockholm will be just as uneventful. Because I wrote down all the dates, I was able to follow you in my thoughts and knew that you were there now. Hopefully, August 11th, 1939. Hopefully, we can really experience my next birthday with you. I can't even put into words how nice that would be. It would be important to know how much foreign exchange is necessary. Unfortunately, it will be much more than you needed, because we probably need flagship money and half of the ship tickets must be paid in foreign currency. Maybe Erich can contribute something, and perhaps with support from an aid society. But just imagine what sums would be necessary to pay for this. I can't imagine that we can get the necessary funds. October 8th, 1939. Tante Rosenchen, Erich's mother, has arrived in London. What a shame it is that she isn't already with Erich. We are unable to get any news from her directly. November 10th, 1939. Because no dispatches can be sent from here without special permission, we will write an airmail letter to Erich today with the request that he telegraph you that we are all well. January 11th, 1940. In regard to the visa, it seems to be quite hopeless. As I already wrote in the previous letter, don't worry about us in this regard. As long as the war continues, it would have been so difficult anyway that it hardly seems as though it could have been possible. March 9th, 1940. Just imagine, a few days ago, I received a letter from Erich that was underway for over 4 months. He wrote about Tante Rosekien's well-being and that he will be writing to you very soon. November 3rd, 1940. Today, Trude, Gertrud Brandt, wrote that Erich transferred money to her. The bank there needs to confirm with Erich's bank, so it can still take some time. It will, of course, be of great help for Trudy. Write to Erich for us with warmest wishes, and don't forget to tell him that his letter was underway for 4.5 months. Today, we found out that Heinz, Gertrud Brandt's son, situation is really hopeless, and every effort was in vain. You can tell Tante Rosenkien in case my letter shouldn't reach her. It has all come to naught. Erich has been really wonderful and spared no money or effort. Trude's fate is really awful. August 29th, 1942. We're so happy that you are successful and that you are there. How much harder it would be if it was different. Although we are so anxious about you. For your birthday, dear William, we were at your parents' and drank coffee to your health. A couple of days later, the parents traveled to Theresienstadt near Prague. We will probably go there in the next while, but do not know the exact date yet. We're glad that we will be able to see each other there again. Father Breslauer's friend, Dr. Alexander, is there too. Likewise, Tante Flora, and countless friends and acquaintances. Tante Hulda leaves her apartment the day after tomorrow. It's supposed to be good for us old people there, especially with the climate and the surroundings. Regrettably, Martin and Johanna are not there, but in the Warsaw Ghetto. We haven't heard from them in weeks, and I'm terribly worried as Uncle Martin was still weakened by his bile disease. Just stay healthy and don't worry about us. I always repeat it in every letter because I do not know which one will reach you. We've had many good and beautiful things in life, wonderful children and grandchildren in whom we have the greatest joy. That is worth so much. When you're old, you really know what that means. At the end of this letter, Sophie asks her daughter to send her dearest greetings to Tante Rosenkien and to Erich. Sophie's last communication was on September 1st, 1942. Tomorrow, we won't be in our apartment any longer. We're going to Theresienstadt to join the Breslauers, Tante Flora, and countless acquaintances. We still have so much to do that I can't possibly respond to your letter in any detail. We're glad that you are well and that the children are happy and such good students. The parents Breslauer will be happy when we share this news with them. We wish with all our heart that you remain healthy. Maybe there will be a reunion. I greet and kiss you 1,000 times, and I remain in love, your Omi and Opa. Before the Nazis' rise to power, Berlin's Jewish community numbered 160,000. By the autumn of 1942, most of Berlin's remaining Jewish citizens, including the Englanders, their friends, and relatives, had been deported. On June 16, 1943, the Nazi regime declared that Berlin was officially, quote, Judenfrei. Gertrud Brandt's letters are fewer in number and date from January 1941 to the end of 1943. Gertrud was an important presence in Fromm's life, and her son Heinz, who survived the Holocaust, remained Fromm's lifelong friend and confidant. Gertrud's letters are addressed to a close friend with whom she was able to carry out a correspondence. In 1939, after the Nazi invasion of Poland, Gertrud and her husband and their youngest son were sent to the ghetto of Ostrów Lubelski near Lublin. The letters were all written during her captivity there. The Brandts were German-speaking Jews who lived in the city of Posen, which had been the capital of the Eastern Prussian province until 1919. When the Nazis invaded Poland, they deported the entire Jewish community of Posen to a series of ghettos. Before the war, Gertrud had been a teacher and a social worker, and in the ghetto, she became a caregiver for children. Her letters are deeply moving. Her reflections on the nature of human relating and love, and the fundamental importance of giving freely of oneself to others, are often profound. She's a gifted writer, and her letters are written in a beautiful lyrical style. I have selected a number of passages to convey their overall content. January 19th, 1941. Reflecting on her experience of deprivation, Gertrud writes, "If you can get used to not expecting anything for yourself in life, really nothing, then you free yourself, and at the same time from dissatisfactions in the present, as well as from a fear of the future. One can learn to experience life as a gift so that it excludes any demand. You're happy, poor, you encounter the difficulties serenely, and you make every effort to help your fellow human being." Throughout her imprisonment, Gertrud's thoughts shift from the needs of those she cares for in the ghetto and the needs of her far-flung children. April 15th, 1941. My eldest, Heinz, of whom I wrote, is in the Oranienburg concentration camp. There isn't any way I can actually help him because one can't send any money from here. In any case, it simply isn't possible because I don't have anything and can only just keep my head above water. I used to get a contribution from a relative in New York, which unfortunately has not arrived the past 2 months. So we are both surviving only from the care packages and the sale of our possessions. As time passes, Gertrud's letters reflect her struggle to hold on to a sense of humanity. June 13th, 1941. As important as it has become for me that you have included me in your circle of care, what really lifts me up and supports me is the fact itself. That a person draws from her own deep source and joyfully gives it to others to experience. It is this power of goodness alone that I so admire. I have no more admiration for cleverness, education, ability, if goodness is not there first. If goodness is not completely determinative at the center of being and everything radiates out from it. How is it possible that even with all this so-called intelligence, civilization has not brought people even one jot further? I believe deeply in the strength of goodness and love and in its eternal and immortal power. It sustains me when I think about it that maybe my days will not be entirely pointless if only a little bit of goodness and love can radiate out from me to others, maybe to some child or a young woman, maybe to a young person who is engaging life and can carry the spark forth. September 7th, 1941. I'm struck with certainty that I want to pass on this love that I receive so that this goodness can become effective as a living force. It calms me and reduces the shame I feel. In October 1941, a series of mass executions of the ghetto prisoners took place. Somehow Gertrud survived. She continued to live in Ostrów-Lubelski for another year and a half. Her final letters reflect the challenge of survival amidst utterly inhumane conditions. End of February 1943. The pain must not solidify and harden. I've already gone through many gates of suffering. They did not lead me into darkness. Like a blind person, when all the senses sharpen, my soul lights torches so I don't lose my way as my life darkens. It is as though all my energy is taken away and consumed, as if the essential living force alone sustains the torches. And this need feeds new energy that is life-sustaining. So I experienced the life-saving warmth, the living proximity of other people, like a blood transfusion in the midst of excessive blood loss. It cannot be compared, not a single word. It is the innermost truth. Do you feel what you have given me and how you help me with the care that benefits and sustains me? It would be best for me now to be intensely active and to help as well as I can. Unfortunately, it won't be possible. The misery prevents me from confronting the need. There are hardly any who can help or are capable of helping. Only those who are in need of help. How this weighs on me. The thought of finding a way through is tormenting. People say it is not possible, and the conditions seem to confirm it. But I want to find a way regardless. If it is not possible, then the impossible needs to be attempted because people are perishing of weakness. They're being lost. Fathers mourn by their families. Mothers mourn by their children. And I can only modestly give of my own and share to the outermost limit. I can only really help very few. I cannot slow the giant wheel of fate. Ever since the packages have stopped arriving, the need is without end. And finally, April 22nd, 1943. Every fear of change has fallen away from me. I have lived a full and rich life, and it no longer matters to me whether it now ends with a long turnaround or is cut short. As long as I can be useful, I want to do it. And who can say to me that under different circumstances, I can't do this just as well or even better? This was Gertrud's last known communication, written on a postcard in which she states that she has to leave the ghetto to make room for new arrivals. She was sent to Treblinka and murdered a short time later. The emotional impact of hearing Sophie and Gertrud's words has not lessened with time. The horrors of the Holocaust still challenge our comprehension 80 years on. Each time I read their letters, I find it difficult to continue with any sort of discussion. Their words speak to the immensity of the pain and suffering to which they and millions more were subjected. I spent many hours studying and translating their letters. I felt privileged to do so. The women I came to know were highly intelligent, incredibly strong, and immensely caring. I grieve their deaths. Being witness to their lived experience, knowing of the horrors they endured, even if only from afar, breaks through the distance of history. We're confounded by the sheer number of the Holocaust victims. But if we focus on numbers alone, we risk losing sight of individual persons. The life of each victim, of Sophie and Gertrude, was as real as our own today. Knowing their stories has become ever more important, especially as the last survivors leave us. How we talk about the Holocaust informs how we respond to the catastrophe and shapes what future generations will know and remember. There's also a different side to this process, one that can be more difficult for German descendants like myself to talk about and engage with. What does it mean for me, a third-generation German, to share these letters with you? How might my family history implicate me in the very crimes that led to the murders of Sophie, Gertrude, and their loved ones? These are not easy questions to answer, but I am surely obliged to ask. I wrote much of this talk while living in central Berlin. Embedded in the sidewalks around my residential block were many stumbling stones. Each commemorating the life of an individual victim of the Holocaust and located in front of the building where they last lived. There are many thousands of victims from Berlin's pre-war Jewish community who have not been individually commemorated thus. Sophie and her family are among that number. While stumbling stones have become an important and moving recognition of the Holocaust victims, we also need to ask how many perpetrators and enablers of the Nazi regime lived on the same residential block and in the very same buildings as their victims. Each of them was a member of a family, fathers and mothers, uncles and aunts, sisters and brothers. Even today, talk of German family involvement in the Nazi past can evoke defensive postures, even outright denial. When shame and guilt are present, silencing is reinforced. Among my generational peers, I encounter an ever-increasing weariness with Germany's memory culture and a wish to avoid any association with its dark history. Quote, "It's so long ago. Why ask questions now? I know what happened. Isn't that enough? I'm tired of feeling guilty. Why should I feel bad about what my family did? I had nothing to do with it." Regardless of who we are or where we live, we're familiar with these kinds of reactions. We don't want to be burdened by a criminal past that is not of our own making. But as Fromm reminded us over and over, we cannot escape our history. What will we find if we turn towards that history rather than away from it? Let me draw on my own German family to illustrate. I learned about the Holocaust from my German parents at an early age. They were born in Hanover in 1935 and joined a large wave of young Germans who immigrated in the decades after the war. I grew up in two cultures and with two languages, made more real by frequent trips to Germany and later years living in Switzerland after my parents returned to Europe. When I was a child, my parents shared with me the horrors committed by Nazi Germany and taught me about the obligation to remember. But as so often happened in German families, just as one door to the past was opened, another remained shut. I have no comparative memory of ever talking about what my grandparents actually did or believed in relation to the Nazi regime when I was young. My family history, like many others, remained shrouded in shades of gray, never distinct enough to make out more than a ghostly contour of what might be lurking. Talk of war in German families is most often of terrible times and the suffering endured, not about responsibility. Growing up, I knew the stories of destruction, loss, and death that my family members lived through, but a full history was kept at bay. It was as though the familiar family narrative had been set in stone. No one seemed to quite know how to challenge it. It was only late in life that I spied an unfamiliar photograph and began to find the words for a history that had remained unspoken, covered over by a blanket of shame and guilt. I did not know that my grandfather applied to the Nazi Party in 1936, was inducted a year later, and participated in the NSKK, the so-called motorcycle and car club used by the Nazi regime to indoctrinate middle-class Germans. Today, we know that the NSKK membership attended lectures on racial ideology, that some participated in the November pogrom, and that a few even provided support for mass exterminations in Eastern Europe. There is no ambiguity in this history, no shades of gray. I struggle to make room for a dreadful history at odds with the memories of the man I knew and loved as a young child. When we reckon with the perpetrator past that we inherit by way of family and community, we begin to break through the filters created. But the ramifications can be difficult. My mother and I began a new and unfamiliar dialogue. It began in fits and starts. Our search led to more photographs that lay filed away amongst old documents in Germany. Soon my mother started to share early childhood memories that felt at times like an emotional torrent, long ago experiences that were waiting to be heard. But while my mother was willing to address the Nazi past in our family, there are others in my family today who feel that I have done my grandfather a disservice. They no longer welcome me into their homes. I share this story with you because it illustrates the degree to which emotional conflicts shape legacies of perpetration, be it within individual families or in societies as a whole. The system of perpetration in Nazi Germany could only function because of the millions of people who enabled the regime, everyday people like my own grandparents, who joined up or willingly looked away, at least as long as it worked in their favor. The act of enabling poses as grave a threat to our society today as it did so many decades ago. Dissociation and denial remain powerful forces, even as we're confronted with the realities of racial hatred and violence that surround us. Fromm understood this and knew what it meant to take a stand. He felt compelled to speak out against forces of destruction and hatred. After the war, Fromm shared little publicly about his family. Yet when he died, a copy of Sophie's last letter was found amongst his most cherished personal possessions. Against this family background, we can begin to appreciate a powerful personal resonance in Fromm's activism and in his emphasis on the need to build an equitable post-war society. At the heights of the civil rights movement in the United States, Fromm spoke directly to the insidious nature of racism and the need to address its source. In the book, The Heart of Men from 1964, Fromm introduced the notion of racial narcissism to explain the terror inflicted by the white majority on African Americans. He drew direct parallels to the subjugation of Jewish Germans in Nazi Germany and asked, in effect, what might we learn from these tragedies so they will not be repeated? Nor was the political situation in post-war Germany ever far from Fromm's mind. In May Man Prevail from 1961, Fromm expressed his concern about whether the new West German nation would ever truly address its dark past. Fromm warned that many former Nazis populated the highest echelons of government. His observations were correct, and we know today that it was only in the 1970s that West Germany began more fully to address its collective responsibility. Nor is it fortuitous that one of Fromm's last and most far-reaching books, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness from 1973, includes a lengthy analysis of malignant aggression and an examination of the character structures of Himmler and Hitler. In the face of the horrors of the Holocaust, it would have been easy for Fromm to ascribe to a popular belief in an innate aggressive drive. But Fromm rejects the notion of internal drives and argues instead that we must work collectively to identify and change the social and cultural conditions that enable destructiveness and hatred to flourish. Yet Fromm also retained a clear-eyed realism. In 1979, he was asked by the same Swiss journalist about whether people had actually learned anything from the Holocaust. Fromm's response was telling. Here we confront the question of whether humans actually learn anything on their own. Do they even want to learn? Or do they remain tied to their entrenched opinions and insights? I believe the readiness to learn is much more limited than we assume. Our lives are structured in such a way that people are first of all oriented towards functioning, but not towards thinking. Fromm believed that it was only by addressing how we function in society that we might begin to move towards a more open-minded position based on rational thought and action. He was encouraging us to engage with others, to build a more just world, in essence, to learn and to love life. This points us back in the direction of Fromm's lived experience and to his work as a practicing psychoanalyst. Fromm's therapeutic approach tends to be little known because, unlike other well-known psychoanalysts, he did not write about therapeutic technique. What we find when we look more closely, however, is enlightening. For Fromm, healing takes place through a kind of empathic dialogue, an interaction that orients us towards the other person, not as an object, but in his or her being. As Fromm writes, the analyst must be endowed with a capacity for empathy with another person and strong enough to feel the experience of the other as if it were his own. The condition for such empathy is an optimal of the capacity for love. To understand another means to love him or her, not in the erotic sense, but in the sense of reaching out to him or her and of overcoming the fear of losing oneself. Understanding and loving are inseparable. Looking back, what is remarkable, in my view, is how much Fromm's perspective on empathy and love has in common with the outlook that Gertrude Brandt expressed in her letters from the ghetto. Particularly when she writes, I believe deeply in the strength of goodness and love and in its eternal and immortal power. It sustains me when I think about it, that maybe my days will not be entirely pointless, if only a little bit of goodness and love can radiate out from me to others. Gertrude's words are themselves echoed by Fromm in his 1956 book, The Art of Loving, where he proclaims, quote, love is the only sane and satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence, end quote. Despite their radically different circumstances, Gertrude and Erich both sought to find meaning and possibilities for human relating, suggesting in effect that it is a potential for empathy and love that forms a countervailing force to human destructiveness and hate. With the benefit of hindsight, I think we can see Fromm's emphasis on achieving a fullness of relational life, together with his social and political activism, as a critical response to the racial violence and genocide of his lifetime. As we confront the political and social turmoil that engulfs our present age, Fromm leaves us both with a warning and a sense of hope. We cannot sit back. We need to be engaged. We need to do more. Throughout his life, Fromm held fast to our potential for learning and loving. That gives me hope. Perhaps, in some small way, my talk this evening can contribute to our shared learning process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger, for a very important and very deeply moving talk this evening. So important for us to hear on this particular day, but I think for us to think about in the coming days and years as we confront a rise of anti-Semitism and racism in the United States and in fact around the world. Erich Fromm was an extraordinary person. You've brought him to us in a beautiful way with the context of his family. And I think his writings deserve another reading from us. I want to respond just to a few things that you've said and to thank you again for what you have said. One of the things that's most striking is that although there have been many incidences of genocide in our world, the Holocaust was carried out by intellectuals, by academics, by people with a PhD. Almost all of those at the Wannsee conference that organized the murder of European Jews had doctorates. And that, of course, throws open the question to us, what does it mean then to be an academic, to be an intellectual, a scholar? What actually does it do to us as human beings? Does it not affect us in some way? That we study, that we learn, that we teach? How can it not prevent us from becoming murderers or complicit in murder? And of course, what fascism does is to destroy the lives of many human beings. But it also forces so many to lose their moral compass and to be bystanders or complicit. I think about the German pastors that I wrote about in a book in which I describe some archival data that I came across of pastors who wanted to participate in the sterilization program and asked for a seminar to be set up in Berlin with some of the leading race theorists because they said people were afraid to go to the doctor. The doctor was going to report them for sterilization, so now the pastors could replace the doctors. It's an absolute horror to read that document and to read so many documents by theologians who were producing anti-Semitic propaganda during the Nazi era. And there are some things about Erich Fromm that I want to just add to because I work on German Jewish history and also Jewish and Protestant biblical scholarship in Germany. Fromm was, as you point out to us, a very special person who focused very much on empathy. And I wonder sometimes when, as you were speaking, to what extent was Fromm either influenced by Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst, refugee in Chicago, or perhaps just parallel to Kohut, or perhaps for Fromm, the emphasis on empathy came from his studies in Frankfurt with Rabbi Nehemiah Noble, the Orthodox rabbi who participated in the Jüdisches Lehrhaus, the adult Jewish education center that was established by Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig in Frankfurt. I know that Fromm studied Hasidic texts with Noble, and knew Hebrew and read those texts in Hebrew. And I imagine, knowing Hasidic texts as I do, that an understanding of empathy, of course, is central in Hasidism, that perhaps Fromm is also expressing in these writings, in his psychoanalytic writings and writing about therapy, something of the role of a Hasidic Rebbe and a disciple, which is a relationship that's very intense, very profound, and that's rooted also in empathy, in Hasidic understanding. And yes, as you point out, it was so important for Fromm to be involved in political work. I understand that He donated the funds from his best-selling books to the anti-Vietnam War movement, and as you say, was involved in the civil rights movement. But in all of this, it's also worth remembering what it was like for him, because in 1937, Adorno wrote to Horkheimer at this Institute for Social Studies in Frankfurt, that Erich Fromm, Adorno felt, was just too Jewish. Professional Jew, he called him, and perhaps even a threat to the work of the Institute. So there are ways in which Fromm himself experienced certain attitudes toward Jews. Adorno's father was Jewish, his mother was Catholic, but even among Jews, a sense of not wanting to be, as they used to say, too Jewish. And that, of course, is part of the German Jewish experience. But I want to come back to the letters that are very moving and mention also a book that I just read about a friend of mine, Rudy Baum, who passed away, who was a refugee also from Berlin and had letters from his parents. And then came the final letter, the last letter, before they too were deported to death, and how that affected Rudy Baum. He didn't speak of it. He had a good life with a wife, children, 3 children, active in the Jewish community in Dallas, Texas. But at the very last years of his life, he became profoundly depressed because that last letter came to him and hit him very hard. And I think for many of us, I wonder sometimes about the letters from my grandmother, many that she sent to my father. My father came to this country in March of 1940, but his mother was in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto, with her daughters, my father's sisters, my aunts. And those letters are just too difficult for me to read through. My grandmother was murdered in Warsaw, one aunt in Auschwitz, another in Treblinka. And these are very difficult memories to keep, to hold. But I do want to conclude with one final point. When you speak of empathy, of course, the question is always to whom, in what condition, what circumstances do we have empathy? Can I have empathy when I go to Germany, as I have done, and I meet people who were themselves Nazis and involved in atrocities? One man that I interviewed, for example, in Lübeck, Hans-Joachim Thilo. What do I do when I talk to someone like that? Or children. A lot of women, especially in Berlin, told me their fathers were in the SS and they wanted to talk to me about it. It turns out my best friend was the daughter of a man who was a doctor and committed atrocities in Dachau. I didn't want to go to Germany, but I went because I had to study German for my own work in German Jewish history, and I thought, well, I'll never go back. And then by chance, I was taken as a graduate student to East Germany, and I spent a weekend with a group doing Christian-Jewish dialogue with East German Christians, Protestants, and they were quite hostile. They were not sympathetic to Jews and the fate of Jews. They didn't want to hear about the Holocaust, and they didn't want to take any responsibility whatsoever, and it was a very rough weekend. And at the end of the weekend, toward the end, I asked the hosts, who were Christian ministers, well, how will we conclude this meeting? And they hadn't planned anything. They said, well, we can conclude with the Lord's Prayer. And I said, no, not a Christian prayer. We need something more ecumenical. So they said, all right. My friend Rainer Graupner, a pastor, said, I'll read a psalm in German and you read it in Hebrew. And so we did that. And then when it was over, somehow I felt that the room was not yet concluded. Somehow there was still a feeling of anticipation. And I whispered to him, I think you should say the Lord's Prayer. And he turned to the group and he told them what had happened, that I hadn't wanted the Lord's Prayer as a Christian prayer, but that I had now said, yes, it's all right. I gave them permission to say their Christian prayer. And everyone stood up and they recited the Lord's Prayer from memory in German. And when they came to the line, "And forgive us our sins," it suddenly had a very new meaning for everyone. And people were in tears, and I was in tears. It was a deeply moving moment that all of us remember. And it was moving because all of a sudden, in the context of prayer, they were able to feel empathy for me, for Jews, for what had happened, what they had done, what their parents had done. And in that moment when they began to cry, I suddenly felt empathy for them. So I certainly appreciate so much of what you presented to us today, and I'm grateful to be renewed in my interest in Erich Fromm's writings. And I also think empathy and love are extremely important. And I just would also suggest that at times, perhaps, the context of prayer, of coming together as Jew and Christian in prayer, may provide a context in which empathy has an enormous power. So I thank you, Roger, for your talk and look forward to our conversation.
I really appreciated your words, also your wisdom, and what you shared from your experience being in Germany. As you know, I've been there the last 4 months. I've just returned to Canada. And while I was in Germany and over Crystal Kristallnacht, or the November pogrom, I was asked to speak, and I read parts of these letters at a remembrance ceremony, and there was a sense of pain and of poignancy that I had experienced only from afar, because of course much of the family lived on those very streets of Berlin. And there was a presence there. And it was, I mean, there's much that came together in those moments, I think, for myself as I read those letters, but also for those who were there to listen to them. I'm not quite sure what I'm trying to express there, but it's the importance of remembering from afar, but the importance of remembering in Germany is just so enormous. And I think we can learn from the collective memory of Germany, but we can also learn and have to learn from the struggle to maintain German memory and to, over time, from one generation to the next. And I think my purpose in sharing some of my own family struggle was that it's not just about my family, but what happened in my family is repeated over and over in other families. And I think it speaks to the enormous emotional tensions that emerge when we are asked to remember in ways that cause us to reflect on what our own families have done as German descendants. But of course, this is also relevant to people in many different societies, members of past and present perpetrator groups. Erich Fromm's work does stand out. It has, at least in English-speaking context, been somewhat forgotten and neglected, though I'm heartened to see that there's a renewed interest in what he has to say, I think because of the growth of fascism. There are so many different things that you've spoken to that I could respond to. And certainly one of the most important ones is the role of empathy. And I think pointing to Fromm's Hasidic background, also within his own family, is hugely relevant in this context. Just to answer the question, to my understanding, Fromm had no interaction with Heinz Kohut, but empathy was a part of his work throughout. And also the importance of distinguishing between empathy as a tool and sympathy, right? So in terms of using empathy to study the role and the actions of perpetrators is very different from having any sympathy with them and just keeping that foremost in mind. And of course, Heinz Kohut also pointed that out. And for those who are interested in this, I refer you to Tom Kohut's new book on empathy. You mentioned Adorno and Adorno's critique of Fromm. I think that's a very, very relevant point. And the history of Erich Fromm and the Institute for Social Research, or the Frankfurt School, has been neglected, and he has been written out of that history, unfortunately. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, I would point out the work of Neil McLaughlin, a sociologist at McMaster University, who's written a whole host of very important articles on this that shed light on that neglected history. I'm just going to stop there for a moment because I imagine there are many questions, and Susannah, you may have some responses as well.
Questions. I see one here is just an empirical question. Are there extant letters from Fromm to his family members?
No, we don't have any at this point. That doesn't mean they don't exist and will not arise. As this work is relatively new on letters and reaching out to different family members, I imagine we might still find out that there are some of these letters. I think what is important to reiterate is that Fromm had access to all of these letters because he was the central person. He was one of the few family members who was fortunate enough to have a well-paying job in the 1930s and was located in the United States, and thus people reached out to him. And letters were shared amongst all family members outside of Germany and Poland. And so he would have read everything that we also talked about today.
I would just mention that the letters that you read are very deeply moving, and they strike me as, you know, the final words that someone wants to give of his life, her life, before knowing that death awaits. And there's an old Jewish tradition of writing an ethical will. Writing what are the principles of my life that I want to pass on to my children, to my grandchildren, extended family. And those letters have that quality. It's not something that most people do in their lives, to write an ethical will. Most people don't want to think ever that they're going to die, but also don't think about leaving a spiritual legacy. And that's really what these letters are, a spiritual legacy. And it is perhaps important for all of us to keep that in mind too, for our own lives, for our descendants to read, to articulate what is most important. This is in some sense a kind of forgotten tradition that has arisen again for these people. But of course, the horror for us is that we know they are going to die. They have a sense that they will. No one is ever 100% certain, but how many of us face that and face the idea that we are going to be murdered by our neighbors, by our compatriots, by people who want to kill us for no reason? It's not an invading enemy army, let's say, but one's own neighbor. There are accounts of this, even in Christopher Browning's book Ordinary Men, of a killer who is supposed to kill someone from the same town, speaking in the same language, and kills him. But I guess in those moments, I also just wonder if, you know, it's almost as if we need another language. When Browning talks about asking how these men, these are police officers sent to Poland to murder Jews. And he said they calm their moral compass. They calm themselves by saying, like, first kill the mother, and then I killed the child. And I killed the child as a mercy killing, because how can a child survive without a mother? The perversion of it, it's such a, it feels this isn't what it is to be a human being. I'm not sure, I'm not sure anyone has the language to begin to describe something like that. How do you do that? How do you kill a mother and then kill the child? So I don't know if we have the language. I think maybe Saidia Hartman, when she talks about slavery and the cruelty of it, has some of the words that we might use. But yes, I see these as part of an old Jewish tradition of writing an ethical will, spiritual legacy.
It's interesting. One of the questions that came in that I think ethical will at least touches a bit is a very large question of what do you think about what would distinguish Jewish love? That's an interesting question, right? Like, and is there something that is a Jewish love? But I can imagine ethical will is a practice that would express love from within the Jewish traditions in such a rich way. I had never heard of that, Susannah. That's really powerful. One question here that I see that's I think it is something that should haunt us as we are thinking about the implications of your talk is keeping in mind what you said about shame and silence. How might you teach a young child about the Holocaust? Like, what now at this point in history, with everything you've just shared about how people are resisting or trying to dissociate, what are some of the ways you imagine we might be able to more effectively teach this next generation about the importance of this?
It's difficult for me to answer the question from the perspective of a young child, but I think from the perspective of a German descendant, what I have learned is the fundamental importance of developing a felt understanding of the traumas and tragedies and horrors that have followed genocide, rather than a distant intellectualized understanding. And I think if we were to consider some of the concerns and weaknesses of some of the approaches within Holocaust education, especially in Germany, it would be that it is at times taught in a very abstract and intellectually distant manner. And doing so allows one to, it's a little like opening a history book and looking at a chapter and being able to close it again at will and put it away. And developing a felt understanding is something of a different nature that helps us become aware that the ramifications of these horrendous crimes continue, and they're still with us today, and they are still felt today. There's oftentimes a desire for resolution on the part of members of past and present perpetrator groups, right? But of course, we know that traumas don't resolve in that manner, and nor does responsibility to remember and to engage with what has happened, right? And so that would be one way I would begin to address that. But of course, it's a hugely complex issue.
I would just add that when I was growing up, everybody was a refugee or a survivor, and so it was in the air all the time, and everybody was talking about the life that had been destroyed, that had been wiped out. Not about the horrors themselves, but to remember what that life was, what it stood for, the Jewish civilization of Europe, which was quite extraordinary. My father was a professor, and so his friends were professors, and the intellectual life, the literature, the music, and it was still inconceivable. How could Germany, with the great poets and writers and musicians, how is it possible that the land of Goethe and Schiller would do such a thing? And people used to say, oh, we thought Hitler would last just maybe a few months, They couldn't possibly put up with someone like that in Germany. So no one had to sit me down and teach me in that sense. And I think what's important is to remember also the people, the civilization, the Jewish life of Eastern Europe, where there was a kind of piety and an intellectual renaissance in so many ways that also was wiped out. So we have to remember that as well. We lost something as human beings, as human society, in losing the Jewish civilization of Europe and the Jewish lives that were lost. And of course, I think the trauma is with us politically and in all kinds of ways. And it's very difficult when people are traumatized. As a friend of mine, a minister in Germany, said, "You don't walk out of Auschwitz with a smile on your face." We're dealing to this day with the aftermath of that trauma in all kinds of different ways, whether it's with personal suffering and pain or with some of the anger and resentment and cynicism. There's so many different ways people react to trauma, and the politics of it and the way it's used and misused. It's really a major break in the history of human civilization as we know. And that trauma is going to be with us for many hundreds of years to come as well.
That's a very powerful note for us to bring this to a conclusion on. There's questions rolling in, and just a tremendous amount of appreciation. People that are quite moved and are grateful for the ways that you invited us into this remembrance tonight, and just all the manner with which this is so overwhelmingly relevant to the present moment in United States and what we're facing. And so I see people doing the hard work here in the chat and in the Q&A. I wish we could get to it all, but thank you for inviting us into this tonight, for challenging us, and Roger and Susannah, for all of what you are doing in this world to help open our consciousness up to the critical importance of this for our generation, for next generations. This was beautiful, powerful, and terrible to experience. So thank you very much. And we wish everyone out there a good night. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in our next conversation. Be well.